Good afternoon. Welcome to this afternoon's edition of the Richard Urban Show. I am your host, Rich Urban, coming to you from historic Harpers Ferry, West Virginia. Today's episode is Freedom versus Oppression, Trump versus Biden. Well, we're less than a week out now from the election, just a few days until November 3rd. And of course, I urge everyone to get out and vote. So, what is the choice facing us? And it's really nothing less than what I just stated in the title of this episode, Freedom versus Oppression. And if you think it's a choice of nuances between someone who's a little bit better and someone who's a little bit worse, think again. There's that old saying, you can't be just a little bit pregnant. Either you're on one side, or you're on the other side. So clearly, one candidate is more toward the good side or God's side, and the other is not. And how do you determine whether something is good or something is evil? Well, you determine it by whether it is in accordance with God's purpose of creation. And what is God's purpose of creation? Is to form godly families, i.e. Genesis 1:28, be fruitful, multiply, and have dominion. And of course, that relates also to the topic we've been talking about of absolute sexual ethics. So let's look at the candidates, President Trump and Joe Biden. We should say President Trump and Mike Pence and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris from that perspective. Well, first of all, we know that President Trump is the president of freedom. And he's the president of freedom in many, many ways. So the first way I'd like to look at is freedom to live, i.e., he is pro-life and he's not for aborting the fetus right up until the time of birth, as is Biden and as is Kamala Harris. And in fact, we're going to look at two articles now about just how incredibly radical Kamala Harris is on this topic. Here we have an article from the National Catholic Register, 14 things Catholics should know about Kamala Harris. So Kamala Harris has a 100% rating from NARAL, National Association for the Repeal of Abortion Laws. She supports killing life in the womb, including at the moment of birth. She's proposed that states with a history of restricting abortion rights should have to secure federal approval before new abortion laws can be put in place. She prosecuted the Center for Medical Progress for revealing that Planned Parenthood was selling baby parts. We're going to get to that more in just a minute. And raided that journalist's home. She would repeal the Hyde Act, which prohibits funding of abortions in foreign countries. By the way, which foreign countries greatly are resentful against us pushing that. We haven't been pushing that under President Trump, though. She voted against the Born Alive Act twice that would give assistance to babies that are born alive somehow through a botched abortion. Incredible. So she would rather have the baby murdered after it's born. Also, she never supported Proposition 8, which was a California law that banned same-sex marriage by the voters' proposition until it was overturned by the Supreme Court, and more. So, incredibly, this is the woman who's running for vice president. And let's look at that other article here. So this is she went after this journalist, Mr. David Daleiden, who revealed that Planned Parenthood was selling baby parts and turned his life into hell after raiding his home, seizing all laptops, using a law that was never before used against journalists. So that tells you a lot about what will happen to your First Amendment rights under this woman right here. So definitely you'll want to keep that in mind when you go into the voting booth November 3rd. So President Trump is the president for freedom of life or for life of unborn children and even born children we saw in that article. And definitely who's fighting for your religious freedoms. He worked to enact an executive order in order to um, stop the enforcement of the so-called Johnson Amendment against organizations or churches that were speaking out about political candidates. And much, much more than that, he supported religious freedom in other countries, and he believes in freedom of religion. Now, Joe Biden is not the person of freedom of religion. If you want to know what's going to happen to your freedoms, look at New York City with Mayor Bill de Blasio. What happens to the Jews there? They can't have meetings. They can't have weddings. They can't worship. They're threatened with arrest. What happens to Christians there? They can't have meetings. They can't worship. They're threatened with arrest. And this is in New York State too. So that's the kind of regulations that Joe Biden wants to put even more regulations, more mandates, which are a thinly disguised veil of persecution against anybody who believes in God or faith. Because you see, the God of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, even though they claim to be people of faith or Catholics or whatever, you can actually have to go by their actions, okay? Decide who is really centered on God and who is not centered on God. And hello, if you don't support life, if you don't support religious freedom, you're not centered on God, okay? You're centered on some other God. That's quite clear. So President Trump is the candidate of religious freedom. What about the freedom to keep your hard-earned money? Well, Joe Biden has said he's going to increase your taxes, although sometimes he says he's not going to increase your taxes unless you're rich. Well, that's simply false. So your taxes will be increased directly or indirectly. And even if you tax the so-called rich, guess what? Somebody has to pay, for the increased taxes on the rich. So in any case, your taxes will be increased. Well, President Trump wants you to keep more of your money and you decide how to spend your money. Isn't that the way it should be? What about freedom from enforcement of all the different regulations and rules of so-called gender identity, or freedom from comprehensive sex education, as I've mentioned in my other recent, video on absolute sexual ethics? Former Vice President Joe Biden is for comprehensive sex education. President Trump is not for comprehensive sex education. He is not for that, but Joe Biden is. That means teaching little kids about transgender and gender identity and forcing it down your throat. And that is really why the Democrats or Democrats and people like that are so livid about the recent Supreme Court appointment and appointment of many other judges, because people who really will respect the Constitution. For instance, as I just mentioned, California voted for Proposition 8 in 2008, which banned same-sex marriage, and here comes the Supreme Court in 2015 to overturn that without any voters. And in fact, the agenda of the left is very unpopular. Like, people don't support these. The same-sex marriage never passed in any state, and instead they want to jam it down your throats, just like Joe Biden wants you to wear a mask. He wants to shut the country down. He wants his view of things. Hey, if you don't believe, as I pointed out in my last segment, that 8-year-olds or 10-year-olds should be able to determine your own gender, well, too bad. We'll force you to believe it. We'll make you believe it through penalties, through fines, even imprisonment. So that's the kind of freedoms that would be taken away. What about the right to bear arms? Well, Joe Biden and Ms. Harris will be coming for your guns, I assure you, meaning that they support things such as red flag laws, which actually kill people when police barge into your home without a warrant in the middle of the night, and people have been killed. Look that up. These laws are a thinly veiled or not so veiled uh, effort to rescind Second Amendment rights. So that's another freedom that will go out the window. What about the freedom to be ruled by laws? Like I said, the court overturned the rightful jurisdiction of the states, the Supreme Court, in the Oberfeld decision, and they overturned that without any elected officials, the Supreme Court justices. Well, Biden and Harris want to pack the court. What does pack the court mean? To be clear, it doesn't mean pack it with liberal justices. It means fundamentally change the composition of the court, add more justices, or even do other different arrangements. So that is completely wrong. And also, the Democrats or Democrats don't play by the rules. They're glad to pack the court. They're glad to change laws so that you can never get your rights back. Hey, if you don't ever get your rights back, that's just too bad because their agenda is the right agenda. And in fact, if you don't agree, they'll prove it to you. How about that? So, so that is just a lot of reasons why, it's really a battle between freedom versus oppression, between good versus evil, between God versus Satan. Yes, and I'm not kidding about that at all. Who is more on the side of God? Do the things that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris promote, like abortion, like restrictions of religious freedom, like all kinds of mandates to shut the country down and against your constitutional rights? Do these promote, the building of a good world? Do they promote the building of families where men and women come together to create beautiful children? No. Do they recognize religious freedom? No. What's happening to religious freedoms? This whole pretty much COVID thing, which has turned out to be, not a deadly virus, is a political. Even recently, there's been reporting showing how there's not 220,000 cases of people dying. How many is it? Is it 110,000? Is it 80,000? Well, 6% are caused only by COVID. Now, they do mix together COVID and pneumonia. So, which caused it first or second? Anyway, it's way less than whatever they're saying. So, this is a thinly veiled disguise to take away your freedoms in so many words. So, do vote for freedom on November 3rd. Do vote for President Donald J. Trump, Vice President Michael Pence. Do not vote for oppression and taking away your freedoms and murder and really just the godless agenda of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. It's not about somebody's personality, whether you think Mr. Trump is a little rough or gruff sometimes, or you think Mr. Biden and Kamala Harris are just so nice. No, you have to go by their actions. Is it so nice to abort children even after they're born? Since Miss Harris wouldn't vote for the Born Alive Act. I mean, murder them. That's murdering them. Then is it so nice to have a vendetta and prosecute the reporter who was responsible for those Planned Parenthood in California settling an $8 million settlement for illegally selling baby parts, but Kamala Harris went after that guy and turned his life, Mr. Delighten, into hell. So if you want a hell-bent administration who supports comprehensive sex education, and every other deviant thing that you can think of, and not God and His purpose of creation and goodness and families, then vote for Vice President Biden and Kamala Harris. Otherwise, do vote for President Donald J. Trump on November 3rd. I will be voting for him very proudly, and I hope you do. So do be blessed. And this is Rich Urban coming to you. And by the way, I do want to predict now, President Trump will win, but he'll win based on you getting out and voting. If you've never voted, hopefully you're registered, because most places it would be too late to register. Do vote. Vote. Get out and vote. Don't complain about anything if you're not going to vote. So do vote, and vote for the godly candidate, the candidate who's on the side of freedom, President Donald J. Trump, who's going to win soundly. Yes, he will. So I am your host, Richard Urban, reporting from historic Harpers Ferry. Do be blessed, and we will see you next time.